many of you are roller coaster enthusiasts? Raise your hand. I'm just curious how many roller coaster enthusiasts we have out there. I'd say maybe about a third of you are roller coaster enthusiasts. I do not ride roller coasters anymore. I have 2 herniated discs in my neck, I think in part due to riding roller coasters. So I gave that up about 20 years ago, but remember, so many thrills of riding a good roller coaster. My all-time favorite has to be the Beast. And I still think that that's one of the best ever. I know when I rode it the first time, I was absolutely terrified, thinking that I literally was going to die. And if you rode the Beast for the first time at Kings Island, you know that feeling when you go up that hill and you kind of curve around and then you start down that hill into those tunnels doing this. And I remember thinking the first time I rode that, I remember thinking, Lord, here I come. You know, Lord, please make it quick. I don't want to linger. It is a thrill being on a roller coaster, but how would you feel if you ever got stuck upside down on a roller coaster? I remember riding the Vortex the first time, the roller coaster that spins and goes upside down. Some people don't like that. I loved it, but I tell you what I would not want to do. I would not want to get stuck upside down on an elevator. Anybody a taker for that? It's actually happened before. It's happened actually in the United States 4 different times over the past couple of decades. It's happened at an amusement park. Now get this, I don't know if the Reinhardts are here this morning, but it's happened 2 times at the same amusement park in Arkansas, okay? So word to the wise, if you go to Arkansas, watch out on the amusement parks twice. People have gotten stuck at I think it's called the Magic Springs Amusement Park. Happened in 2007, happened again in 2017. With a power outage, people had to be rescued. Nobody wants to be stuck upside down. Nobody likes that feeling. And so we've been talking about the upside down in terms of the values, the priorities, the things that are most important in kingdom living. And Jesus made it clear. He did not come just to spruce up Judaism. He did not come to just add something on what somebody else has done. He's bringing a whole totally new way. And so when Jesus came, he talked about the priority of taking up our cross daily and following him, what it means to die daily so that we might have life. That seems like kind of upside down thinking. Jesus talked about if you want to be first, you want to make yourself last. Or if you want to be the greatest in the kingdom, you need to make yourself a servant or a slave to all. And so we got into a discussion about what some of these things mean when it comes to looking at things in a certain kind of way. Things can look a certain way, but they are not that way. As I share here on the screen, you see one of the slides I showed you in the very first sermon, and I asked you, when you look at that, are those objects moving? And you remember I said it may look like it's moving to you, but it's not. We're not looking at it the wrong way. We're seeing something we think we're seeing, but we're not seeing it right. And that's just an illustration to us that we need to be willing to look at things from a different point of view. We need to be willing to be taught, and we need to be willing to even accept some of those things that are challenges that seem in life that there's a lot of ambiguity, things we don't understand. We live in a world of paradoxes. In fact, this is just a little review. What is a paradox? It's an absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition that when investigated or explained may prove to be well-founded or true. So it may or may not be true. It seems contradictory. It doesn't seem right. How can you live and die at the same time? Or how can you have life through death? Or how can you live free in Christ and yet at the same time He is Lord, Master. We serve Him. He owns us. We make ourselves His servants, or literally the New Testament says make ourselves slaves of Jesus so that we might have freedom in Him. That seems almost contradictory. And then last week we talked about the idea of what it means to have everything. I mentioned that we have everything that we need in Jesus, no matter what we have. In other words, we can be poor and yet rich in Christ. We can have nothing and yet possess everything. This seems like a contradiction. And so today I want to talk about another paradox that is introduced in all kinds of different ways in Corinthians. And that paradox is the idea of living as a fool to become wise. Or the flip side of that is it possible to be wise in some things and wise in a lot of things and yet be a fool at the same time? Is it possible? So when we think about that question, I guess if you were going to ask a lot of people in the world today, or many people in the world today, about our message, our life, our faith, how do many people in the world today view our life, our faith, the things we profess, the way we live? There are a lot of folks out there who would say, you're wasting your time being here today. There are a lot of other things you could be doing, much more important. It's certainly a better use of your time. Some people think the whole thing about Christianity is just foolish. I remember when, right close to when I was first converted, I had not converted to Christ yet, but I was looking into it and exploring it. And I had an uncle through marriage, and they are now divorced, but at that time, he spent some time in our home, and he knew that I was digging into and exploring faith and what that meant in my life. But he was the kind of person who, I guess, taking advantage of a young teenager, would find ways to needle me and question me, poke fun sometimes in a, quote, playful way, but it was kind of intimidating. This uncle who says to me, you know, Grady, the Bible's full of all kinds of contradictions, and Jesus, people say he was a perfect man, but Jesus, I remember this verbatim, he said, look, when Jesus said to that woman and the people around, those who were here who without sin cast the first stone, and he said to me, Jesus didn't cast a stone, did he? He was without sin. So his reasoning, therefore, was that Jesus was sinful. I don't know what form the opposition, the resistance, the unbelief may take in your life. And I believe there are answers to every one of these questions that people may have about Christianity. But the fact is, just to accept in the premise of this lesson, a lot of people out there think we are foolish in the eyes of them and in the lives of others. What you're doing is a waste of time. It's irrelevant, and it can be very, very foolish. And yet, here's the question. Having said that, and looking at this paradox of what it means to be wise and what it means to be a fool, I want to ask you the question, are you willing to live as a fool for Christ? Are you willing to live as a fool for Christ? One of the passages that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, Paul said, if anyone thinks he is wise by the standards of this age, he should become a fool so that he may be wise. Wisdom through foolishness. And you notice fool up there is in quotes. Obviously, we seek God's wisdom. We want to be filled with the wisdom of God and demonstrate that. But a lot of times, we need to embrace what maybe many people are saying about our faith in terms of not necessarily believing it, but being willing to accept the fact that there are lots of things when it comes to our faith on the surface might seem very, very, very foolish. Now, the Corinthians, and that's the whole context of this discussion, they were foolish about a lot of the wrong things. And so this whole discussion of what it means to be wise or what it means to become foolish is in the context of a couple of things going on at Corinth. The first thing is this. The church at Corinth was a church divided. And what I mean by that is, just as the first letter to the Corinthians immediately begins, Paul starts right with a core issue, a problem in that church. People have been converted to Christ, maybe Apollos, Peter, others were instrumental in their conversion, and there was a tendency of those people to align themselves in a sectarian, in a cliquish sort of way with those who taught them. And so there was this competitive spirit, even in Corinth, about all kinds of things. And you had people say, hey, man, I'm of Apollos, and this one says, no, I'm of Paul. He's more intellectual, but Apollos, he's a great teacher, and he converted me. And people are saying, I'm with this one, I'm with that one. And Paul says, look, this division is rooted not just in selfish desires on your part, but it's fueled by the context and the culture that you're living in. It was very much a time, a culture that placed so much weight on who you were in society and how powerful you are and whether you were a winner or not. And this competitiveness, this having status above others and associating ourselves with people of status so that we can feel the same way, kind of a version of, if you're a sports fan, you have a favorite team. How many Bengals fans do we have here this morning? Yeah, okay. Come on. 2? No, that's bad. That's terrible. And they're 3-1. They're winning. But how do we do as fans? What do we say? A lot of times. They play the game and they win. What do we say? We won, right? We. Well, you're not a member of the Bengals. You don't play football. You're not getting paid to do that. How in the world can you say that you won? You didn't win. The team won. Yet we know what we're talking about. You know, we can identify ourselves with something that maybe makes us feel important, such as a winning football team or a championship or whatever else that might mean. And a lot of times it gets pretty ugly when fans are going at each other. Well, there was a little version of that going on in Corinth, to the degree that they were ignoring open, blatant sexual sin, where a man was with his father's wife in a relationship and nobody was doing anything about it. And part of the reason nobody was doing anything about it is because they were all divided up into these camps. And it paralyzed them. They were selfish about what they did in their worship assemblies. They were inconsiderate when they came together for a common meal that was commonly called the love feast. And a lot of times when that was done, it was done many times in connection with the taking of the Lord's Supper. And you had people who were not waiting on others, not helping others. They were being selfish. They were thinking of themselves. You had other cases where brother was bringing another brother to court in front of pagan judges. Others were saying there was no resurrection. Others were making other claims that were contrary to the will of God. The church was an absolute mess. He says, you weren't baptized in the name of Paul. And he said, Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach, not that he had anything against baptism. But it seemed like one of the things that they were doing is whoever converted them and baptized them, they had this kind of special allegiance to that person in a competitive way, and the church was divided. Paul says, I can't remember everybody I baptized, but frankly, I'm happy that I didn't baptize very many of you, lest some of you say that I baptized in my name. He says, I came to preach the gospel. That's my calling. There were other people who could baptize people who wanted to commit their lives to Christ. I came to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. So one of the problems was division, and the answer to that in the context right there in 1 Corinthians 1 is holding up Jesus and the power of the cross. Is holding up the Jesus of Golgotha, Jesus of Calvary. So intricately connected to this question, are you willing to be a fool for Jesus? And I put that in quotes. Are you willing to embrace the foolishness? The foolishness, in quotes, the foolishness of the cross. Because it was considered foolish by many back in that day, not just today. There were the Jews who looked for the Messiah. They wanted a conquering king. They wanted somebody who was victorious, somebody who would exert power over the Romans who ruled them. They weren't looking for a Messiah who would be crucified as a criminal and hang on a cross between two criminals. That was scandalous. That was a stumbling block to them accepting him. The Greeks or the Gentiles, the idea of a God who is powerful and mighty and greater than anything, humbling himself and becoming a human being, but not just becoming a human being, but becoming a human being and suffering and going through torture and difficulty and then going through that humiliation on the cross. I mean, you think about it. People back in that day even, they think this idea of God on the cross, you've got to be joking, right? There's power in that. There's strength in that. Paul says you need to look at things differently because on that cross something great happened. Even though a lot in the world might have said it's foolishness for God to humble himself and to go through this, something was accomplished on the cross that day. Because in his humility on the cross, he was displaying weakness, but there was great power that came out of that weakness. And the power that came out of that weakness was the power of love and the power of salvation and the power of redemption. Because in that cross, in that weakness, God in the person of Jesus willingly accepts the justice, the punishment, the wrath that sin deserves as our substitute. That's the wisdom of God. I don't fully understand that. I can't comprehend everything that relates to this whole idea of salvation and redemption, but I accept that. Here's something else that was going on at Corinth. Paul was foolishly compelled, at least in his own mind, he felt like he had to defend himself against people who were accusing him of all kinds of things. You look at the Corinthian correspondence, you see that people were saying that he was undependable. Some of them were saying that he doesn't keep his word. Others were saying that he's in trouble all the time. He's been arrested. It's clear that God is against him. And then you had another group of people, and they referred to themselves as kind of super apostles, maybe even greater than the apostles themselves, who were questioning the legitimacy of Paul's ministry altogether. They were saying to him, you don't belong. You don't have the gravitas that you need to be the kind of apostle that's really going to get things done. And besides the fact, your life, a lot of it is just a lot of losing. How are you demonstrating a victorious life by being shipwrecked or beaten or put in jail and all those things you're going through? What do you do when somebody makes an accusation like that, right? What do you do? Do you let it roll off your back? Do you forget about it? I remember early on in my ministry, there was someone who was the spouse of one of our leaders, and she was saying things about me behind my back, and it was some pretty rough stuff. I didn't know about it until people started coming to me, members here, saying, Grady, so-and-so said this about you. And then another person would come. This person said this about you. And listen, I'm a young guy. I'm just starting out. It's hard. It's not easy to be criticized. What do? Do you just let it roll off your back and just ignore it? Well, I felt like in this case, I just couldn't ignore it. I felt like too much was at stake if there was somebody in this church who was undermining my credibility to all kinds of people. And when it comes right down to it, it was a silly thing. But I felt like I had to take action and do something. And Paul felt the same way. He was, in a sense, he was forced to defend himself because he felt there was so much at stake. Some of the criticisms about Paul, here's another one. For some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he's unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. Now, in the context of this day, the whole idea of public speaking in a certain way, using certain rhetorical devices, being the kind of sophist or speaker that could impress or make a sound argument or be eloquent before others. Paul says, listen, I don't want to get caught up with any of that. So I think Paul would have been just fine with people saying, look, you don't measure up to the public discourse teaching standards of the day. And that's what they were saying. But I don't think that was not the main problem. I don't think Paul had could accept the fact that people didn't think he was a great speaker. I think Paul is thinking, and the reason he's doing what he is doing is because there's so much at stake for their life and their faith. Once again, you destroy the messenger, and you don't necessarily destroy the message, but you can hurt the message. You attack the one who shares the gospel and says, this is the gospel, and this is what you need to believe. If there are other people not only saying, he's not a legitimate teacher, he's not a legitimate apostle, but maybe you need to listen to us. And we have some other things to add to that. So in 2 Corinthians, a lot of 2 Corinthians is spent defending himself. He says in verse 1 of chapter 11, I hope you'll put up with a little of my foolishness, but you're already doing that. I'm jealous for you with a godly jealousy. And then in verse 5, I don't think that I am the least inferior to those super apostles. I may not be a trained speaker, but I do have knowledge. I repeat, he says in verse 16, let no one take me for a fool. But if you do, then receive me just as you would a fool, so that I may do a little boasting. Are they servants of Christ? And he's talking about these who were opposing him. Some of these folks who claim more authority than him. Some who were challenging the credibility of his life and his ministry and his work. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. And then he says in chapter 12, I have made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles, even though I am nothing. So the heart of this criticism, they're thinking he's a fool, and he's thinking, I'm foolish to even be defending myself. Now, I shouldn't have to do this. He loved the Corinthians. And he says in places in these chapters, I long for your heart. I long for you. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I want you to understand that if you abandon the core foundation of your faith, not just rejecting me, he says, your faith, your life, it's in peril. And so he responded. He was willing to respond. He was even willing to do it because he's saying, look, go ahead and call me crazy. You're saying I'm out of my mind. Go ahead. I'll wear that moniker. Because to him, to Paul, one of the chief badges of authentic life and ministry in Jesus is not always being happy, always being successful, people always listening to you, you being happy all the time, you having success all the time. Sometimes there's struggle, and that's where this upside down paradox comes into view. Paul was looking at things in a totally different way. Okay, a couple of quick takeaways in terms of how we apply this. Here's the first one. I'm going to spend about 30 seconds on this one. Your troubles don't mean that God is against you. Now, it's possible that you may be facing some difficulties and some struggles and going through trials because God is allowing them in your life, not for a nefarious purpose, but for your good, because He loves you. And just like a father loves his children, just like a mother loves her children, they train them, they discipline them. Sometimes there's sometimes an element of discipline to that, and sometimes there's an element even of punishment to that. But it's not punitive in the sense that you're just getting back at someone. God never allows anything in our lives to make us less or to make us not have what we need. He's working so that we understand that and embrace that. God's not against you. The second takeaway, you can't improve the gospel. This is so important, because that's where Paul starts in this letter. That's where every individual, every church needs to begin and end. It can't be improved upon. And so sometimes I think we need to grapple sometimes with this idea of trying to connect with people around us and doing those things that will help us connect. But understanding that ultimately what we do or how it looks is not the power to make the difference. I mean, this space right now is a lot different from what it was, 2 years ago? We have these screens, we're doing things online. But we're not doing it to just impress people. The improvements on the website, whatever it is we might do, those efforts are done to better connect with people where they are. And so we update our website, knowing that people go to a website to check out and find out about the church. But we need to be careful that we don't get so caught up in the idea of a certain method or a certain procedure or a certain approach becoming so ingrained and so important that we forget the power's not in any of these things. Ultimately, the power is in Jesus. You cannot improve the gospel. And if we attempt to water it down, it's going to lose its power. When Paul begins in the first chapter, he said, "Lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." And that's done by ignoring the true nature of the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, what He's done to save us. Here's another takeaway. We're all equal at the foot of the cross. So in Corinth, you had all these people who were divided. You had one above another. You were caught up in this class distinction and your rank in society. And Paul says to them, you're all the same at the foot of the cross. The cross is a great equalizer. And that humility, while the world may look at that humility at the foot of the cross as dumb or pointless, or why do you want to prostrate yourself before Jesus and the cross, the idea is when we do that, one of the results is we realize we're all the same, right? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Number 4, when we share Jesus in the gospel, we need to share Jesus in the gospel with great humility. And this gets back to that whole idea I mentioned right at the beginning. And that is when we're sharing the gospel, when we're doing what we're doing, when we're saying to others that Jesus is the answer, or we say to somebody, you need Jesus, we're not doing it out of arrogance. We're not doing it out of a position. And if you're viewing online, maybe you're looking for the first time. When we say Jesus is the answer and you need Jesus, it's not being spoken with arrogance at all. It's spoken with conviction. It's spoken with the belief that we believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But we share it with great humility. We do not share it from the place of saying I am better than you, or I'm more important than you, or I'm even necessarily do more good things than you. We're saying that we get to this place, the same footing of the cross, and Jesus brings us together. And when we do that and we share it, we do it with great humility. The next thing here is, are you willing to become a fool for Christ? Are you willing to become a fool for Jesus? I encourage you to embrace the cross. Are you willing to embrace the folly, the foolishness of the cross and become a new person? This is where it happens. This is where it happens. Where is the power? Where is the power to live the kind of life and be transformed into being the kind of person God calls me to be without the power within through what Jesus did to save me and what He's given me? It's not me. It's not me. Even when I respond, even when I accept it, I put my faith in Jesus, I'm baptized into Christ. It's just me accepting the free gift. And it's God's love changing me to where I can do things and share and give and do in ways that I never would have been able to imagine. Forgive, love the unlovable, overcome bad habits and addictions and people issues. The answer is being transformed by the cross. And even though some people call it a folly, it's not. It's okay if that doesn't work anymore. Are you willing to become a fool? Are you willing to become a fool for Jesus? A fool for Christ. Wise, but a fool. Fool, but wise in Christ. I'll tell you about upside down. I'll tell you about the cross, and I'll tell you about death. It wasn't just the death of Christ. It wasn't just Him going to a cross and dying and suffering. You see, He turned death upside down when He was raised from the dead and became alive again. And I know there are people back then, people today, who say people don't die and come to life again. I believe there's lots of evidence for that. And I believe it even though I was not there. The truth is, I believe that Jesus, when He died, He not only died, but He paid the debt for our sins, experienced the pain, the punishment, the agony of hell in His person to turn death and the power of hell upside down. And God invites us into that life to become a fool for Jesus. So we want to say as we close this morning, whether you are here with us in this assembly or whether you're online, please contact us if you want to take some next steps in terms of your faith journey in the Lord. That may mean being baptized into Christ, committing your life to Him. That may mean something else. But we want to help you get there. Not because we're so smart and so mighty and so great. Not at all. It's that we as beggars, in terms of what we found in Jesus, and when we speak to you, we're speaking as one beggar telling another beggar where to get bread. It's in Jesus. Sean?